Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're on chapter 5, text 17. Chapter 5, text 17. Molly, give me a thumbs up. Okay. Well, let's, just without an introduction, let's go ahead and read the verse. We're going to go through it real carefully. So, in English, sometimes you might describe somebody by a feature that they possess. An example I thought of, just that I use oftentimes, you might say the redcoats are coming. It's kind of a well-known bit of American history. The redcoats are coming. You don't mean that there's red coats on a rack rolling towards you. You mean that British soldiers who historically wore red as part of their army uniform are coming. So the word red coat is used to indicate a person who's wearing the coat. You follow? You might also say you're just a suit. Have you heard such phraseology before? You're just a suit. And so it doesn't mean that you're literally, it's just a suit that you're talking to. It means that the person lacks originality, or they're representing some official establishment or institution or something like that. Does that make sense? Or they're doing something which is mechanical, that could be done by anybody, and so that what they're doing is not special. They're just a suit. You follow? So in Sanskrit you have the same thing. You have compound words, and the words indicate the person who possesses that feature, whatever that feature might be. I gave two features with clothing, but there could be other ones. Blondes, right? Doesn't mean just the color blonde. It means somebody with blonde hair. So, anyway, I think the point's clear. Tat buddhyaha. Tat buddhyaha. Tat buddhayaha. Buddhayaha comes from Buddh, which means to be enlightened, which is where you get the word. Let's grab it. There you go. Don't kill it. Just grab it. There you go. Thank you. Buddhayaha. It's in the plural. And it comes from the root Bud, which is where you get the word Buddha from, or Buddhi, or intelligence from. So Tat Buddhaya, those whose intelligence is focused on that. Tat in Sanskrit means that. Chapter 5, text 17. Tat Buddhaya. For those, it's in the possessive case, for those whose minds or intelligence is dedicated to that. Now you see the word dedicated? The word dedicated isn't in there. It's implied. Literally the compound says, for those whose intelligence is that. But then what you do in at least in Sanskrit, what you do is, if it says, for those whose intelligence is that, what are we dealing with here? It's a B? Well, then obviously you shouldn't pick it up with your hands. I apologize. Yeah, I got it. I understood. I guess you guys are sweet or something like that. You're attracting bees. You good, Alex? Okay. Literally the word says, for those whose intelligence is that. But then what you do, at least in Sanskrit, I don't know like other languages on this level. We don't do this in English. I know how to speak Spanish, but they don't do this in Spanish either. So there might be other languages that do this. But in Sanskrit, if you say hammer illusion, you might mean the illusory hammer, or it means the hammer for smashing illusion. And so a lot of times you'll take a verb and you'll attach it, and you're just supposed to be intelligent enough to figure out what the appropriate verb is. Does that make sense? So for those whose intelligence is that, for those whose intelligence is focused on that, dedicated to that, absorbed in that. Did you follow what I just said? Did you follow this? Okay. So there's a certain amount there's a certain amount of filling in the blanks that's required to read even a simple verse like this. It's not really complicated, but this is just how the Sanskrit language works, where you'll have compound phrases like this, and it assumes familiarity with what would be the appropriate way to attach the words together. Did you follow that? In this case, with a predicate. And now that we've done one, you're going to find we can do them all. Tat atmanaha, same thing. Tat atmanaha, same thing. Possessive case. For those whose what? Atma. For those whose self is that. What does that mean? For those whose self is that. What does that mean? Yeah, so maybe the first one be for those whose minds are focused on that, for those whose selves are dedicated to that, absorbed in that. Now, of course, an obvious question that we have to ask, and we should have asked it instantly, is what? What's that, right? Okay. This is why I didn't bother to give an introduction, because to explain the word that requires us to give an introduction. And then how would we... Now, when you're studying a text, not even necessarily a sacred text, when you're studying any text, like there was a famous biblical scholar, and when he would teach a class on biblical exegesis, on interpreting the Bible in a rigorous way, the first book he would give to his students at the seminary was a book called How to Read a Book. The book had nothing whatsoever to do with theology. But if you want to do theology and interpret a sacred text, what do you have to know how to do? You have to know how to interpret a regular text. You follow? There might be rules which are specific to sacred texts, but the background or the backdrop or the kind of basic skeleton of interpreting a sacred text is the same as interpreting a regular text, and you got to add some bells and whistles and some extra criteria to it. Did you follow that? You're following this. Good. That's good. Yeah. Okay. Tanishta. It's the same thing. Tatnishtaha. Nishta means fixed or dedicated, or one's what one's situated in. Nishta would be equivalent to faith. Nishta in Sanskrit would be faith or conviction or determination. Now see how each one we do, like your intelligence is dedicated to that, but then that doesn't work. So then we have to go, your intelligence is focused on that, because the next one, yourself is dedicated to that. You follow? But then Nishta itself means dedication. So each time you get a new one, it modifies ever so slightly what word you might pick for the preceding one, because you don't want to be redundant and you want to make it flow, because Krishna's trying to communicate something. You follow? So now, for one who's dedicated to that, right? For one whose self is absorbed in that, and for one whose mind is focused on that. You see how I add a predicate in to link a subject and an object together? That's really what I'm doing, right? I'm linking a subject and object together with a predicate.
More or less.
You want to say it better? He's a linguist.
When you put a verb in an object, you predicate that information on the subject.
Fair enough. So the object is part of the predicate. So technically, what I said is incorrect. You're taking a subject and an object, and you're making the object part of a predicate by linking the two of them together with a verb. I store. I went to the store. The past participle of the infinitive verb to go. Right? Yeah?
Just the past tense,
I can't get it right. I'm close, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess having gone to the store, right, would be the past participle, right? Okay. Fair enough. All right, so when you take a subject and an object, you put it together with a verb. That's what's happening here. The object is the word tat, which means that. And the subject is the person, I guess, whose intelligence is focused on that. So even the whole thing is part of the object, really. The subject is unstated. Intelligence, that. The person whose intelligence is focused on that. You follow? So the whole thing is part of the predicate, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a compound noun, right? It's like that knowers and like that devotees, that those kinds of things, right? It's a tut noun, Buddha noun.
Yeah.
And it's like a that knower, or like a that intellector. So
Yeah, however, bahuvrihi, the word bahuvrihi, which is the type of compound this is in Sanskrit, it means much rice, literally. Bhagavad means much rice. And so it means, when you say much rice, it means the person who has a lot of rice. You follow? And so, like you might call a person, why is the screen frozen? Tadeo, can you see me? Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
But we cannot see you.
Okay. Yeah, I got this crazy look in my eyes, and the screen's frozen. Can I just start the video again? Huh? Hey, somebody signed on to Zoom as me. Please sign yourself out as me. I'm assuming it's a Nandini, and you've totally messed things up. So please sign out immediately. And now start the video again. Can you see me?
Not yet.
FaceTime camera built in. I'm going to give up pretty quick. That was just microphones. That wasn't the
You want to start over with the meeting? Sign out and sign in?
No, I don't want to start over. You sure you can't fix it?
It freaked out. That double log.
It freaked out. Select a camera. Select that again. Let's see if I come up. All right, I'm going to log out. You guys stay on. I'm going to log out real quick. I'll log back in. Wait, if I log out, does everybody disappear?
You'll have to log back in at the end of the meeting.
Oh, man. Anandini, what did you do?
It wasn't Anandini. Your video froze, so I logged into it to try to unfreeze it from a different account, from as you also, but your video was frozen beforehand.
Okay. So I usually when a video freezes, it unfreezes. So next time, don't do that because...
It was like 90 seconds.
Jeez. All right, listen, guys. Please, all of you, log back in right now. We're hanging up. Adios. All right, I'm going to log back in. Another B? Jeez. Huh?
Still not seeing the video.
I'm still not seeing the video either. Press stop video. Okay, now press start video. Go down here and press start video. Right down here. Did you took away the camera that we're normally using to do it?
Yeah, but it's not seeing it.
But it's not saying anything. Is it plugged in? See where the cord's going to. We have no idea. You want to go video settings? See what the video settings says?
We could reboot the computer.
Web camera, original mirror my video, turn off my video. I don't know. You don't know?
We could reboot the computer. That's probably
Reboot the computer?
Yeah,
How long will that take?
a couple minutes.
Really? Otherwise I can just be blank on the screen. What do you think?
Yeah.
Alright, I'm going to be blank on the screen. Okay, guys. you're going to get a blank screen. It's your karma for all the times you blanked your screens out. Now I'm going to look at you guys. That's just what it is. That's how we're rolling today. My apologies. You guys can look at a black screen. It's a BLM moment. We're doing a little solidarity. But yeah, I apologize. I don't know what happened, but the screen froze up. Okay. I mean, this is going to be actually disturbing for me to look at myself on a blank screen as I'm trying to talk to people. I'm just going to roll with it. Okay. Tat budyaha. Tat budayaha. Intelligence focused on that. Those whose intelligence is focused on that. Tadatmanaha. Those whose self is absorbed in that. Tanishta, those whose are dedicated to that. Tatparayanaha. Parayanaha means dedicated to that. You see how each one messes up interpreting the last one in the way we want to? Tatparayanaha. Tatparayanaha means those who are dedicated to that, those who are convinced about that or have faith in that, those whose selves are absorbed in that, those whose minds are focused on that. Gachanti apuna avritam. They go to the place you don't come back from again. Apuna means not again. Puna means again. Apunaha means not again. Apuna avrita means you don't return from again. So you go to Gachanti, you go to Apuna avritam, the place you don't come back from again, which means you go to liberation. Because in Indic philosophy, reincarnation is the default. So if you go to the place you don't come back from, that means you go to heaven. You go to liberation. Jnana nirduta kalmashaha. Those for whom knowledge has purified them of contamination. Those whose contamination has been wiped away. For those whose contamination has been wiped away by knowledge, for those whose faults have been wiped away by knowledge, for those whose hold that as the highest object, for those who are dedicated to that, for those whose selves are absorbed in that, for those whose intelligence is focused on that. For those people, they go to the place you don't come back from, they go to liberation. And again, the big $1 million question is, what's that? Yeah, that's the big question. What is that? So, if you were going to learn how to read a book, let's just assume for a moment that you all know how to read a book. Not how you know how to analyze ancient Sanskrit literature, but you just know how to read a book. If you were told, what does that mean? How would you answer the question? What does this mean? And what does that mean? You just made the situation much more difficult because you introduced another, what do you call it? You introduced another demonstrative, and now you have to explain to me what's the difference between this and that, which you can't do. I know you can't. It's not difficult, and all of us know it, but we don't know it. We know it the same way. We know how to see, but we don't know exactly what's happening, how light is reflecting off of things, entering into our occipital nerve. So we just know what it's like to do it, but we don't actually know. I'll give you an example. And this is going to be weird for you guys with a blank screen because my gesticulations would help you figure this one out. But here's a cool thing for you. When you look at a cartoon in a comic book, when you look at a comic book, you see pixels. I'm assuming it's pixelated. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's like an inkjet. Maybe it's not in pixels. I'm not exactly sure how they print comic books these days. I'm assuming it's pixelated on some level. And you see the comic book people, villains and heroes, and they're interacting. And you ascribe consciousness to them. That's how you can follow the story and appreciate how the comic book characters are fighting or doing whatever they're doing with each other. You follow? But those comic book characters on the piece of paper, on the book you're looking at, aren't conscious. It's just ink on a piece of paper. But you import your own understanding. You import your own understanding. And you grant it to them so that you can enjoy the story. Did you follow that today? Give me a thumbs up. Did you follow? That makes sense? Okay. But we, as physical beings, if we are nothing more than a brain, we're no different than that comic book. We might be a much more complicated comic book, but ultimately, from a physicalist perspective, we're made up of chemicals, we're made up of atoms, we're made up of subatomic particles and subatomic particles at this point, because we're getting better with better microscopes. We're made up of gluons and bosons and neutrinos and atoms and you follow? We're made up of ones and zeros. We could be written as binary code according to any physicalist perspective. And that we're computational. But then there would be no reason to assume that we would be conscious. There would be no reason for us to be conscious. The whole point of physics is when you understand the initial conditions, those are the things that you accept exist automatically, like space, mass, and time in Newtonian physics. And there's a whole bunch of other features within quantum physics that exist. And when you understand the initial conditions, basically the stuff that exists, what are called fundamental particles. And then you also understand the fundamental forces, strong and weak nuclear force, and electromagnetism and gravity. Then you understand how the universe came to be, because the universe is really just interactions of fundamental things according to fundamental forces. You follow? Did you follow that? But there's no reason why fundamental things operating with fundamental forces should give rise to consciousness. There's nothing in physics that explains why we are conscious. If you had the initial conditions and the fundamental forces, you could predict the universe expanding as it is, thermodynamics, the universe is cooling down, entropy, all that stuff you could predict what would be going on, but you couldn't predict that we would become conscious. It doesn't fit. But the whole point of math, the whole point of physics, the whole point of doing this type of an experiment is we're supposed to be able to explain how we got here, and it's not just chaos. Even though you have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle woven into the fabric, which basically means that quantum physics is non-deterministic. we would never be able to guess at people becoming conscious. When you look at emergent phenomena, like if you look at like a traffic jam, it looks bizarre. It doesn't make sense. One person slows down, and the other person has to slow down a little bit more, and like all of a sudden you get a traffic jam. It doesn't make sense. Or a swarm of bees. It doesn't make sense how all those independent items get together and make something. Or termites make a termite hill because they act. There's an emergent phenomena where a bunch of small things act together, and they become something totally different. But once you see that thing which has existed, you can work back and you can show how it happened because of the initial states and forces. It just wasn't obvious to you. But you can always show how it had to happen because it's just physical things operating according to fundamental forces. Did you follow this? But there's absolutely no reason why we have to be conscious. It would be just as easy logically to conceive of a universe where we existed just like we do and we moved around without any consciousness, which proves it's not necessary that we become conscious, which proves that like we don't have, there's no like proof of it. Our current system does not explain consciousness. Did you follow this? We're conscious, therefore we ascribe consciousness to the world in which we live. Our source must have been conscious in order to give us that consciousness. Our consciousness must have come from some fundamental feature of the universe which has been as yet unexplained because all of the physical explanations we've offered do not account for the almost insuperable problem of consciousness. And it's not just like we haven't gotten good at it yet. There's a fundamental impossibility in that chemicals, atoms, all of the laws we have of physics simply do not result in consciousness, yet we have it. Tadeo, did you follow that?
Yes, Prabhu, I have a question. I will play devil's advocate here.
Don't do it yet. Let me finish, but I'll come back to you in a minute. But thank you. Just give me a second. Did you guys follow this? But you couldn't explain that. We have a sense of it, though. I'm conscious. There's a difference between life and matter. There's a difference. There's something that's like to be me. A chair doesn't have a sense of what it's like to be me. Consciousness is this irreducible feature of the world. It's the least doubtable thing in existence. René Descartes made this point. I think, therefore I am. It's impossible to doubt that point because even to doubt it requires you to exist. Consciousness is therefore the least doubtable thing in creation. Your senses can deceive you. In fact, we can prove how that happens. That's how magic happens and optical illusions happen and all sorts of stuff. But you can't doubt that you exist because the very fact that you're doubting it means you exist. It's the least doubtable thing in existence. We all understand this, but being able to explain it is different. You follow? This means something that either in space or time is close to me. This moment. That moment. That moment means a while ago. This book. It would be this. If I said this book, right here, this book, it means this book. If I say that book, it means one of your books. This close to me, that at some distance from me. That's how these demonstratives are used in any language. Every language has these to explain what is close to you and compare it to what is further away from you. And that closeness can be either spatially or it can be from the point of view of time. This, that. What does that mean in this verse? In this verse, what does that mean? Let me ask you again. Given that you would know nothing about sacred texts, you only knew how to read a book, how would you determine the meaning of this? If you only knew how to read a book, how would you determine the meaning of this? Look at another verse. Maybe. Can you make this a little bigger for me? Like it used to occupy the whole screen. I could see more than I can see now. There's other people that I don't see. So how do we get it to where I see the people on the side, where I was before? No. Full screen? Leave it. I don't want that. Go back. Sri Devi really messed us up here. If I just knew how to read a book, what would I do to figure out what that means in this verse?
You would put preceding sentences.
Yeah, I wouldn't look at another verse. I would look at the preceding verses. You said another verse, right? But that could be the subsequent verses or the preceding verses. Would it make sense? Huh? What?
Next one before or after is what I meant.
Right. That would be the preceding or the subsequent verses. And I'm saying it does not make sense that we would look at subsequent verses to understand what that means. Why not?
Because it could be a different understanding. It's not that.
It's okay. Why wouldn't I look at a subsequent verse, Alex?
Because if it's referring contextually, then you need to look at an anaphor, something that came before it, so it's referencing something you've already stated.
Clearly, if you say that, you're referring to something which has already been established. Therefore, looking to future verses doesn't make sense because the word that is used as a referent, contextually here, it would be used as a referent to refer to something which preceded. Therefore, saying you would look at another verse, the one that came before it or came after it, doesn't work. You follow it now? Like I said, if you want to understand a sacred text, you have to be able to understand a book. There's no way to get around it. You have to be, I don't know. I don't think it's a high level of intelligence. But I think that we don't oftentimes really learn how to learn, and we kind of know stuff, but we don't really know it. And when you got to slow it down and explain it, a lot of times people fall apart. A friend of a friend, whose name was Uli John Roth, he's the lead guitarist for the Scorpions. He used to teach something called the Sky Academy, where he taught people how to play like concertos on the electric guitar. It's never been my cup of tea, but it's that, like that crazy psycho, symphony-esque, like peeling guitar solos. So he would teach the Sky Academy, and he would teach people how to play like he did. He was one of the best players in the world. And guys would come who were in bands, like serious musicians would come and learn from him. And they would be incredibly good at playing guitar. And they would always say to them, okay, just play that real slow now. And a lot of times, people could play it fast, but they couldn't play it slow because they only learned how to play it fast, but they didn't know how to slow it down. They didn't have that expertise. It's a whole nother level of mastery to be able to slow it down and explain it. That must mean the previous verse. You follow? So the first thing we would do is we would look at this verse and we would go back to that verse in order to find out what the that in this verse was referring to. Who can tell me? We spent several days, over several weeks, studying the preceding verses. What's this verse referring to when it says that?
Transcendental knowledge.
Perfect, Darshan. That's right. Remember how it says that knowledge is like the sun? That knowledge illuminates everything. That knowledge cleanses you. Remember that? The knowledge that you have nothing to do with this world, that you're a spiritual being, that you're a conscious being, that you exist beyond this mortal frame. So now we can read this verse and we can say, for those whose intelligence is focused on that truth, that you are a spiritual being, focused on that knowledge, that you are a spiritual being. For those whose self is absorbed in that wisdom, that you are a spiritual being, in that wisdom that you exist beyond this world. For those who are dedicated to that truth, that you are a spiritual being, that you exist beyond space and time. For those who are dedicated to that reality, that you are in fact spirit and not matter. Those people, they go to a place beyond time that you don't come back from. Those people whose contamination has been taken away or nullified by knowledge, which also indicates that knowledge is the natural state of affairs, that knowledge has a possibility of cleaning the soul has a possibility of becoming purified. There's a whole bunch of sort of implications of this idea. Okay, did you guys follow that? Okay, excellent. And then, Tadeo, you had a doubt?
I wanted to...
Play devil's advocate, go ahead.
I want to play devil's advocate when you're discussing consciousness and chemicals.
Go.
So, I could say that I believe you are creating a false dichotomy by postulating the existence of consciousness being separate from chemicals. I actually believe that consciousness is a result of chemicals itself. It is not separate. It is chemicals itself that gives me consciousness.
Sure, you can believe that, but believing it and having a cogent or reasonable argument for it are two different things. You haven't actually made an argument or played devil's advocate. You've just said, I believe Jesus Christ died for our sins, died on the cross. I believe that hell is eternal and you can go there forever. I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. You could say, I believe anything, but that's not playing devil's advocate. Devil's advocate would be that you actually made an argument. For me to respond to what you said, I'd have to make your argument for you and then respond to it, which I can do. I understand how an atheist would say this. They would say it's an emergent phenomenon. That's why I explained that emergence doesn't suffice. But the point I was making, that you seem to have missed, is that chemicals, atoms, aren't conscious. But yet somehow or other, we are. A physicalist explanation of the world takes initial conditions and fundamental forces and then demonstrates how the world necessarily automatically arises from those things interacting. The reason we believe a Big Bang is because things are cooling off and moving away from each other. That's why we have these like laws of thermodynamics. And so to just say, I think magic. I think that, magic exists. I think that Puff the Magic Dragon exists and lives by the sea. And that's an American, what it is, nursery rhyme or something like that. It was a movie that came out when I was a kid. Puff the Magic Dragon lives by the sea and frolics in the ocean in a land called Homily. So you could say you believe anything. But I anticipated a belief in physicalism, and I offered two defeaters. Number one is I offered a really interesting thought experiment of how we ascribe consciousness to something on a page where it doesn't actually have that. We bring the consciousness to that equation. But we, from a physical perspective, are really just a complicated version of dots on a page. And I also brought up the point that emergence wouldn't account for it, which essentially is just a fancy way of saying, I believe it's magic. And I also brought up a third point, which is that if we had the initial conditions, which we do, and we have fundamental forces, which we've postulated, somehow those don't account for consciousness, and so you have to add something else in to account for consciousness, otherwise it becomes this ghost in the machine that is not explained in the current theory. And I offered a logical argument for that, which is that when you talk about things from a physicalist perspective, you have to show how they had to happen because of things, just like you can show with emergence that those things had to happen. If you can't show how it had to happen because of that, then things become arbitrary, and you've just moved out of the realm of science and into the realm of superstition. And amazingly, people just say they believe it, but they don't actually offer any evidence, although some people do, and I just took the major arguments they make in a very simplified form and offered counter-arguments to them. But if you want to step up and argue with me, you're going to have to either do a better version of articulating the arguments I made or come up with a new one that I haven't anticipated or that I didn't cover, and then we can have an actual argument. Where is that? It's in the preceding verse. But I'll get back to you in a second, Narayan. So, Tadeo, back to you, sir.
So, the chemicals and electromagnetism itself is, in Paris, I can observe that. Through science, I can see that those things come together and gives rise to consciousness. Where you, on the other hand, you are postulating that consciousness...
Wait, hold on.
Cannot be measured by science.
Hold on. How can you say that those things give rise to consciousness? Because logically, those things can interact without any consciousness. In fact, we find that they do. Consciousness is a feature that you have, that other forms of life have, but those features aren't held in the chemicals themselves. Otherwise, all chemicals would possess consciousness. Somehow or other, you're conscious, and that consciousness may be controlled to some extent by your brain function. It may even require your brain function in order for it to manifest. But that's much different than causation. Showing neural correlates is much different than demonstrating causation. Back to you.
It's clear now, Prabhu. Thank you.
I can keep going. You want me to keep going?
No, causation explained it to me.
Yeah, just because you can show relation does not mean you've demonstrated causation. And you also can't demonstrate that it had to happen this way based on the forces you have. Therefore, you don't have a scientific explanation. And you can try to explain consciousness away as being merely behavior, which you could then do from a physical thing. The problem is there's something that it's like to be conscious that goes beyond just the behaviors associated. I have feelings and ideas and thoughts, and there's something that's like to be me and see the color red that goes way beyond my behaviors. And that's a problem for cognitive science. And that's called the hard problem of consciousness. And it seems to me to be an insuperable problem. Because what they do is they just simply brush consciousness under the carpet, but never actually address with it. And now you have the cloud. It's actually what, Rene Descartes and all those idealists, who are the people who said that, mind exists as separate from the body, they just kind of got rid of the consciousness so they could do hard science. Because they didn't want to touch consciousness with a 10-foot pole, because once you do, all your physical formulas fail because they can't account for it. And nowadays, we're not really doing anything different. We just deny consciousness and ignore consciousness, and we think if you explain the behavior, we explain consciousness, and we make a little sleight of hand. You try a little magic trick on me. You try to pull a card, from out of your sleeve to win the poker hand. And you said you thought that relation proved causation, but it does not. Did you follow that?
Yes, Prabhu. Causation was the piece I missed, and it is clear now.
It helped you?
Yes.
Okay, good. And I treated you like a atheist rascal because I figured that's what you wanted from me when you said you were playing devil's advocate. Obviously, I know that you're trying to tighten up your own arguments in this regard, right?
Correct, Prabhu.
Okay. What do you got for me, Alex?
Maybe I can salvage a piece of Toto's argument there when he said there's a false dichotomy that instead of committing him to emergence, is a panpsychism compatible with
Yeah, panpsychism is the belief that every atom is conscious on some level. And there's a guy named Tononi who's come up with a theory, kind of a modern day theory of panpsychism, that everything in the universe is fundamentally on some level conscious. his theory is because it processes information, and that consciousness is non-different from information processing. Panpsychism fell out of favor about a century ago. The idea that every atom is conscious. But I'm not averse to that. That's great. Then we've still said that consciousness is now an irreducible feature of the world. You would have to now explain how when all those individually conscious things come together, they create something that's universally conscious, namely us, and then we lose our individual consciousness for all intents and purposes. You'd have to explain that. You got some big hurdles you got to overcome. It seems like it might be with Occam's razor. I'd rather just have to describe one thing than a bunch of things. And so, the physics tries to get things down to the simplest forms. And if you do explain two things, then you have to explain what are those fundamental forces that unite those things together, and you're back to a much more complicated explanation. You follow? So there are some philosophical reasons why a singular entity, a monistic entity, is better than a panpsychic idea. But I'd call that a win for me if you went the panpsychist route, and then I could just argue that point with you, and I would use a whole different set of arguments. And I'm giving you now an idea of where I would go with that. But we would now get over the physicalist, atheist argument. We're now in a panpsychist world where you have a fanciful belief system, and I'm now going to show you why my idea is better than your idea, and I'm going to use a whole different set of arguments to do it. Did you follow that? Did you follow that, Tadeo? It's getting fun, right? So here's the thing. It's one thing to understand something intuitively and even be able to frame it out intuitively. It's another thing to be able to argue it. And you have to become skilled at basic critical thinking, at being able to read a book. And then we take a look at the beautiful ideas contained within this book, and we can appreciate them because we go through a little bit of a rigorous understanding. And I don't just say, well, this book teaches whatever I want to say. I look at the book, I see what the wisdom contained within it is, and I figure out how to practically apply it in my life. But I have to start with some critical thinking skills, with the basic ability to read a book. I have to understand the difference between this and that. I have to know I have to go look at another verse, and that verse should be the preceding verse. I have to understand some of the basics of nouns and objects, or subjects and objects, and how they're connected together with words. I have to be able to look at the verse. It's actually quite a beautiful verse, right? The elegance at which they're able to state something very simply in Sanskrit, which packs a wallop. It would take a whole paragraph, right? To understand, right? It's very simple, though, isn't it? And so, welcome to a serious discussion on a spiritual text. What do I got, 5? I got 7 minutes left. Now that we've looked through a verse, now I've just been enjoying looking at these verses with you guys. So I've broken. Normally I go through 10 or 20 verses at a time. I read them in English and pick out a couple of words in each verse that are the core ideas. But the last couple of classes, I've done this for whatever reason. I don't know. I like the verses. They're cool verses. And actually every verse in the Gita lends itself to this kind of an interpretation. I normally just don't want to freak out your brains. And so I go for something a little more flowy that has the major theme of a chapter as opposed to getting into the minutia of a verse, because most people don't have the... What? What don't they have?
Like critical thinking?
Yeah, they don't have the focus. It might seem like it's intelligence, but it's the ability to focus and really work through it in a systematic way. And so I usually try something which is a little more engaging, a little more easy to enter into. But our texts are deep. I mean, this is how I study. And so I figured I'd give you guys a little bit of like a different look. Now, in terms of taking this verse, now that we've really fleshed out this verse, what are we saying? We're saying that transcendental knowledge that you're not the body, knowledge that there's something beyond, knowledge I just made arguments for in modern language, not so different than this. But I took it and I revamped a little bit. I put old wine in a new bottle. I used some fancy terms like panpsychism, and I'm aware of Tononians, information processing, and I can relate to things you guys relate to. But it's the same idea. It's the same basic wisdom. You are not your body. You are conscious. Consciousness is different than the body. It's special. It's more important. It's what you should focus on. Instead of having a yoga butt or finding a husband or a boyfriend, or upward mobility in your career arc, or getting a real cool beanie to wear, you know what I mean, or what the perfect 5 o'clock shadow looks like, or you know what I mean, like what color you should dye your hair, do I look fat in this? And, like all the petty stuff that most people spend a big chunk of their life doing. This is infinitely more important. This is magic. Why is it that eggs turn into flying birds? It's magic. Why is it that water's wet? You follow? Do you understand? We can describe, the laws of physics aren't actually what's happening. They're laws that describe magical phenomena of how atoms hold together. And then they decay. That's strong and weak nuclear force. Electric charge, that's electromagnetism. Gravity, why objects attract each other? Why do objects attract each other? It's magic. You follow? Even though they postulate fundamental particles and fundamental forces, that doesn't explain them away. It just gives a name to this amazing feature of reality that we don't have an explanation for where that came from. That's why we call them fundamental particles and fundamental forces. We might as well just say it's magic. Because we can't explain why it happens that way, just that it does happen that way. And all the magic in this world, nothing is as magical as consciousness. And it would seem to be that we're conscious, that the source, just like the source of reality, seems to appreciate, like if you look at like where everything came from, you follow? If you say it just is, then it has to be eternal because it must always have existed, because it must be necessary. So if it came from somewhere, then everything in this world has to be accounted for by where it came from. You follow? That's the explanation. You have to explain how this came from that. You follow? So we're conscious. So our consciousness must have come from that. There's magic. 2 minutes? It's all around us, and nothing's more magical than our consciousness. And if we dedicate ourselves to exploring that, to thinking about that, to living in a life which is in accord with that, to simple living and high thinking, to being in this world but not of it. If we dedicate our lives to that, then we become like that. And this world becomes an ever so more magical place than it already is. These verses have life to them. They give inspiration. If you understand them, you're like, yeah, I want to focus on this. I want to take my life to this. I want to hold this as the most highest object. This is my core belief. This is my core identity. I'm not going to sacrifice this to get in some kind of codependent relationship with the material world. And this filters down the way you live your life with people, and the way you live your life with this body, and the way you live your life with this world. And the world becomes an infinitely more magical and beautiful and wonderful and luminescent and illuminated place. Thank you, IGTV. Adios.